It was Christmas Eve. The aroma of roasted turkey filled the air. The soft glow of candlelight bathed our long mahogany dining table, a cherished heirloom passed down from my grandmother, Eleanor. I had dedicated 2 days to preparing this feast. The creamy mashed potatoes were perfectly seasoned. The cranberry sauce had reached its ideal chill, and 2 pumpkin pies and 1 apple pie sat cooling on the sideboard, a tradition unbroken for over 35 years. As always, I found myself at the far end of the table, expertly carving succulent slices of the golden brown turkey. My granddaughter, 19-year-old Chloe, glanced up from her mobile device and declared, loud enough for the entire family to hear, that older people should learn to occupy less space. It wasn't a spiteful remark. She seemed to view it as a playful jest, anticipating laughter from her cousins, and they obliged, some nervously, others more boisterously. My daughter Isabel simply rolled her eyes and resumed scrolling through her phone, feigning unconcern. But I remained still. I didn't react. I didn't offer a correction or seek clarification. I simply smiled. For sometimes, silence resonates more profoundly than any words could ever express. Unbeknownst to everyone gathered around that beautifully decorated table, every present nestled beneath the shimmering Christmas tree was a gift from me. The tablets, the athletic shoes, the spa vouchers, the luxury handbags, and Chloe's entire college tuition, every single dollar, resided in an account under my name. They were oblivious to this fact, because I had never sought their gratitude. I never mentioned depleting a significant portion of my retirement savings to secure Chloe's future. I never reminded them of the countless hours I'd spent soothing Chloe while Isabel worked night shifts, or the joy of teaching her to read, or the tears I'd shed the night she was accepted into Stanford University. No one knew, but on that night, as my own granddaughter dismissed my very presence, something within me shifted. I looked at her, and saw not a child, but a young woman who had forgotten the foundation upon which her life was built. So I quietly rose, removed my apron, and left everything, including my wounded pride, on that table. What they didn't know was that I was about to reclaim it all. Before I begin, please let me know in the comments where you are joining me from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more compelling stories. Prior to that evening, I would have described my life as fulfilling, not extravagant, not flawless, but rich and meaningful. I am Eleanor, 68 years of age, a retired school teacher, a widow, and until recently, the focal point of every family holiday, birthday celebration, and backyard barbecue. I was never the most vocal person, never one to crave attention, but I was the constant, the unwavering support system, the dependable presence everyone turned to in times of crisis, the person who ensured everything ran smoothly, and I relished that role. My husband, Arthur, succumbed to cancer 9 years ago, his journey from diagnosis to passing spanning less than 7 months. We had shared 42 years of marriage. He was the kind of man who always ensured my car had a full tank of gas and prevented the overflowing of the rubbish bins. He affectionately called me Nell, a shortened version of Eleanor, and often said I made our house feel like a home. After his death, I dedicated myself wholeheartedly to my family, striving to remain indispensable. My daughter, Isabel, was struggling to raise Chloe alone. Her husband had left when Chloe was only 4 years old. I moved in to assist, assuring her it was temporary, just until she found her footing again. That temporary period extended to 6 years. I collected Chloe from preschool, crafted her Halloween costumes, and patiently taught her to read. In the evenings, while Isabel worked double shifts, Chloe would drift off to sleep in my lap, her tiny fingers entwined with mine. I didn't mind. I never kept track of sacrifices made. Even after returning to my own residence, I maintained daily contact. Sunday dinners were sacrosanct. I prepared pot roast, mashed potatoes, and asparagus, following my mother's cherished recipes. And Christmas? Christmas was my domain. I went all out, adorning the banisters with garlands, placing pine-scented candles in every room. I baked an abundance of cookies, filling the house with a delightful aroma for weeks. My gifts weren't just material, they were memories, handwritten letters, framed photographs, and personalized stockings, embroidered with each family member's name. Yet, somewhere along the way, a subtle shift occurred. It was gradual, almost imperceptible, a chilling draft one overlooks until one shivers with its impact. Chloe began to roll her eyes. Whenever I shared stories, Isabel stopped soliciting my assistance with holiday preparations. Conversations became shorter, less frequent. My opinions seemed to hold less weight. They called it independence, I called it invisibility. Still, I persisted. I believed that continued generosity would serve as a constant reminder of my importance. The college fund was the most significant contribution. Chloe had worked diligently, achieving straight A's, participating in volunteer work, and receiving numerous leadership awards. She had earned every opportunity. However, Isabel lacked the financial means to cover the tuition fees, and Chloe's scholarships were insufficient. So, I intervened. I liquidated Arthur's antique coin collection and a portion of our travel annuity. Quietly, without fanfare, I wrote a check for $55,000 and opened a separate account in my name for Chloe's tuition. No one inquired, no one knew. I simply acted out of love. My expression of love wasn't about grand gestures or social media posts. It was about quiet, unwavering sacrifice. I would occasionally view photographs of Chloe on social media, at her dorm, at a sporting event, on a beach during spring break, and smile contentedly. She never tagged me, never expressed her gratitude, but I didn't require it. Or so, I convinced myself. Love, I believed, was unconditional. Until that night, when I realized they hadn't merely forgotten my actions. They had forgotten who I was. They continued to attend Christmas at my house for the warmth, the food, the gifts, but not for me. I had become the background noise in their lives. And still, I smiled. I continued cooking. I set the table with fine china. I folded Chloe's preferred linen napkins, and even prepared a vegetarian side dish of wild rice stuffing to cater to her newly adopted dietary habits. I believed these actions held significance. I believed they saw me. But now, I understand. They didn't see me. They only saw what I provided. That was the last Christmas I would ever selflessly give them unearned gifts. I recall the first time I felt it. Not heard, not seen, but simply felt. That gradual erosion of respect. It was subtle, so subtle, that I almost persuaded myself it wasn't happening. It was late October, just a few weeks before Christmas. I had stopped by Isabel's house to deliver a loaf of freshly baked zucchini bread, still warm from the oven, and wrapped in foil, just as Chloe used to love. She had texted that morning, informing me that she'd be home from university for the weekend. I thought a brief visit might be pleasant. When I knocked, no one answered. I waited patiently, smiling, listening to the muffled sounds of conversations within. Then, the door opened slightly. Chloe stood there, wearing a stylish top and a comfortable oversized sweatshirt. She was engrossed in a phone call. Her face brightened momentarily upon seeing me, or at least I thought it did, before quickly reverting to indifference. "Oh hey," she mumbled, her hand still holding her phone. "Grandma's here with zucchini bread. So retro, right?" she said, into the phone, letting out a laugh. Her friend on the other end responded with laughter. "I know, right?" Chloe added, before stepping aside to allow me entry. "Retro, like I'm a vintage record player, or a cassette tape, a quaint relic." I smiled, as always, attempting to shake off the sting. I told myself she didn't mean any harm. It was merely a joke, teenage sarcasm. I entered, handed her the bread, and said, "I thought you might enjoy a taste of home." She glanced at it, gave a quick, distracted thanks, and placed it on the counter as if it were a forgotten receipt. No hug, no real conversation. She kept her phone in her hand the entire time. Isabel wasn't home. She had a date. Chloe mentioned it casually while scrolling through social media. "I think it's her 4th date with that guy from her spin class. She says he's really attentive," she said, chuckling again. It felt as though I had entered a stranger's life, as if I were observing my own family from behind a glass partition. When Chloe was a little girl, she would shriek with delight upon seeing me arrive, wrapping her arms around my legs and exclaiming, "You smell like cookies, Grandma." Now, I barely received eye contact. I sat for a few minutes, attempting to inquire about her classes. Her responses were monosyllabic. "Psychology," she replied, when I asked about her major. "It's fine," when I inquired about her progress. "Not really," when I asked if she needed anything. The conversation was as thin as tissue paper. Then came a moment I didn't anticipate would linger in my memory. I complimented her outfit. A simple gesture. "That color looks stunning on you, Chloe. It really makes your eyes sparkle." She looked at me and, with a smirk, retorted, "You'd be amazed how many guys on campus agree. Guess I inherited the good genes, huh?" It wasn't what she said, but how she said it. A subtle jab disguised as a compliment, as if I were a withered branch on the family tree she had once climbed. When I stood to leave, she didn't accompany me to the door. She didn't inquire when she'd see me next. She simply waved, her gaze already fixed back on her screen. As I walked to my car, I turned and looked at the house, the same house I had helped Isabel establish when she was a single mother, just beginning to regain her independence. I remembered painting the porch, planting the rose bushes along the walkway, and a tiny Chloe helping me water them, singing to the blossoms. And now, I was merely retro. Driving home, I felt that first tiny fissure in my chest, a cold draft penetrating my being. But I dismissed it. She's just young, I told myself. College students are often like that. She didn't mean it. I'm overreacting. I desperately wanted to believe that, but deep down, I knew something had irrevocably changed. I was no longer a source of inspiration, someone they looked up to, but someone they simply looked past. It wasn't a singular event, it was a gradual unraveling. 1,000 tiny cuts, unnoticed by everyone but me. After that October visit, I found myself hesitating before contacting Isabel or texting Chloe. I used to send frequent check-in messages, thinking of you, or saw something at the farmer's market that reminded me of you. But their replies became shorter, colder. Chloe often didn't reply at all, already taken care of. Don't worry about it. No greeting, no thanks, Mom. Just a curt dismissal, as if I were an unwelcome guest, rather than the person who had taught her how to cook. I told myself not to overthink it, but a few days later, I posted a photograph from a local autumn festival on social media. Just me, holding a caramel apple, smiling beneath a canopy of vibrant fall foliage. I noticed that Isabel and Chloe had liked every post that week, from influencers, celebrities, even their dentist's dog's Halloween costume. Not mine. Not a single like, not a comment. I wasn't angry. I was hollow, as if I didn't exist in their digital world at all. At Thanksgiving, matters worsened. I had offered to host, but Isabel insisted on holding it at her home this year. She claimed I shouldn't overexert myself, but I understood the subtext. I was being subtly excluded, like a cherished recipe they had decided to discard. Still, I arrived with my famous sweet potato casserole, the one with the brown sugar crumble topping everyone used to fight over. I wore my favorite emerald green cardigan, the one Arthur always said made my eyes sparkle. When I arrived, no one looked up. Isabel was in the kitchen with her new boyfriend, Daniel, a man with booming laughter and equally boisterous opinions. Chloe was setting the table but didn't greet me, simply nodding curtly and continuing to scroll through her phone. When we sat down to eat, no one mentioned the casserole. They complimented Daniel's smoked turkey and Isabel's store-bought cranberry relish. When I offered to say grace, Isabel quickly interjected, "Let's just eat before it gets cold." I felt myself shrinking in my chair. Chloe spent most of the dinner discussing a leadership conference she had attended, boasting about networking with future CEOs. She made a joke about how older people don't understand TikTok, and Daniel roared with laughter. I smiled politely, but inwardly, I was retreating into a version of myself I barely recognized, quiet, cautious, invisible. After dinner, while they all sat around sipping wine and watching football, I stood alone in the kitchen washing dishes. No one offered to help. When I dropped a plate and it shattered, Isabel didn't even glance up from her glass. "Just leave it, Mom," she said, her tone irritated. "It's not a big deal." I bent down, my hands trembling, to clean up the shards. My knees ached, my eyes stung, and still, no one moved. I began to feel like a burden in the very space I had helped create, tolerated, not treasured. The following morning, I awoke to find my phone inundated with Black Friday deals. I scrolled past advertisements for items Chloe had mentioned wanting, but noise-canceling headphones, a designer handbag, concert tickets. I began compiling a list of gifts, as I always did, but for the first time I paused. What was I giving to people who no longer saw me? Love is not a transaction. I didn't crave gratitude, but I needed meaning. I needed to feel valued, not just for my casseroles, my money, or the space I occupied in a photograph. As the days passed, that emptiness began to manifest in ways I couldn't ignore. I stopped humming while cooking. It took me longer to get out of bed. The photographs I used to print and display now lay in a disorganized pile on my desk. Even my garden, once my pride and joy, began to wither. I neglected to water it for a week. The roses browned at the edges, the lavender drooped. It was as if the house itself sensed my fading vitality. That's what it feels like to be slowly erased, not yelled at, not attacked, but simply unseen. I wasn't angry. I wasn't heartbroken. I was disappearing, and no one noticed. Christmas Eve arrived as it always had, soft candlelight illuminating the windows, the scent of cinnamon and pine filling the air, and the familiar melodies of my old record player serenading us with Bing Crosby's White Christmas. I had been awake since 5 a.m., basting the turkey and meticulously folding linen napkins into the shape of poinsettias. The house was immaculate, sparkling in every corner, Each dish was carefully placed. I even set Chloe's place with a delicate silver charm bracelet I had discovered in a local boutique months earlier, a tiny C, delicately engraved on its surface. I wrapped it in tissue paper and tucked it beneath her napkin. I wanted the evening to feel special. I desperately longed to feel seen, to be acknowledged once more. They arrived late, as usual. Chloe entered first, followed by Isabel and Daniel. Isabel called out, "Sorry, Mom, traffic was a nightmare," without looking up from her phone. Chloe breezed past me with a cursory, "Hey," tossing her coat onto my armchair, as if it were a coat rack. I told myself it was fine. I presented the appetizers. They scrolled through their phones. I lit the candles on the table. No one noticed. Dinner commenced. I carved the turkey, served the dishes, and attempted to maintain a lively conversation. I asked Chloe about her final exams. "They were fine," she replied, reaching for more potatoes, without making eye contact. "I aced my statistics class, got an A. "Well done, sweetheart," I said, smiling. "You always had your grandfather's aptitude for numbers," she shrugged. "I think it's more about work ethic than genetics." That's when Daniel scoffed. "Eleanor, you're still writing checks, right? Maybe Chloe can help you set up online banking this year." Laughter erupted around the table. Isabel chuckled. Even Chloe cracked a smile. I forced a polite laugh. "I manage perfectly well, thank you." But the worst was yet to come. As the main course concluded and I went to retrieve the pie, I returned to the dining room just in time to hear Chloe declare, "Older people shouldn't take up space. No offense, but sometimes it's like they don't even realize they're just in the way." I froze in the doorway. The words hung heavy in the air. Everyone heard them. No one corrected her. Isabel sipped her wine, remaining silent. Daniel smirked. I looked at Chloe, her face radiant with self-assuredness, laughing as if she had just uttered something witty. And in that moment, I didn't feel hurt. I felt erased. I placed the dessert plates down, without uttering a word. I retreated to the kitchen, stood by the sink, and stared out the window into the darkness of the backyard. My reflection appeared in the glass, a weary woman with impeccably styled hair, a pressed crimson sweater, and eyes quietly brimming with unshed tears. I longed for someone, anyone, to follow me, to say, "Mom, that was out of line," or "Grandma, I didn't mean it that way." But no one came, no footsteps, no apology, no voice calling my name. So I wiped my hands on a dish towel, returned to the dining room, and gazed at the table that had once felt like home. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I simply smiled, the kind of smile women adopt when they've been hurt so often that they've learned to cloak their pain in politeness. "Excuse me," I said softly. "I forgot something in the car." They nodded, their attention elsewhere. Isabel didn't even look up. Chloe was already texting. I walked to the hallway, grabbed my purse and coat, and quietly slipped out the front door. The cold air hit my face like a bracing slap, sharp and cleansing. I walked to my car in silence. Not a single voice pursued me. Not a single person inquired about my destination. Inside my coat pocket, my hand brushed against the envelope I had intended to give Chloe after dessert, a final check, substantial enough to cover her spring tuition and textbooks. I removed it, held it in my hands, and tore it in half. Right there on the sidewalk, under the glow of twinkling lights and falling snow, I shredded it into confetti, not out of anger, but clarity. I had given them everything, my time, my money, my memories, my space, and all they had offered in return was silence. 48 p.m., I received a single group message in the family chat. "Isabel, thanks for dinner, Mom. Everything was amazing. Love you." Chloe added a gif of a dancing snowman. That was it. I stood in my dimly lit kitchen, still wearing the red sweater I had ironed that morning, and stared at the blinking message. I hadn't even been missed. Not truly. My absence wasn't alarming. It was convenient. I surveyed my house. The guest bedroom still held fresh sheets and a lit candle awaiting Chloe. The stockings on the mantel hung full. Her charm bracelet remained tucked beneath her napkin. The pies sat untouched, and the gifts, meticulously wrapped and labeled in my best cursive script, were still under the tree. I left everything exactly as it was and went to bed. But I didn't sleep. Not because I was sad, but because something deeper than sadness had taken hold. I felt as if the foundation of my life had shifted, imperceptibly, yet significantly enough to alter everything. Even though the surface remained unchanged, I had finally accepted a truth that had been whispering to me for years. I was no longer an integral part of the family. I was a placeholder, a background figure in photographs they rarely printed. And if I left, truly left, they would adapt. They would absorb the silence and move forward. The following morning I arose, prepared a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table, watching the snow blanket the yard. It was beautiful, quiet, clean, undisturbed, and for the first time in a long time, so was I. There's a peculiar quality to grief when it ceases to demand attention. Mine had settled into stillness. No more hoping for calls, no more checking for likes, no more lingering at the periphery of their lives, awaiting an invitation. I made a decision that morning. I would cease appearing where I was merely tolerated. I packed the gifts into a large tote bag. Every candle, every scarf, every electronic gadget Chloe had requested. I included the envelope, containing her tuition refund. Then I loaded it all into my car, and drove to the respective return counters, one by one. No drama, no ceremony, just quiet, decisive action. When the bank opened, I spoke to the branch manager, and closed the college fund account I had created in Chloe's name. I requested a cashier's check for the full balance, reissuing it in my name. The clerk asked, "Would you like to inform the beneficiary of the change?" I smiled, and shook my head. "No, I think she'll figure it out." That evening, I poured myself a glass of red wine, and settled in by the fireplace, with a book I hadn't had time to read all season. The tree lights twinkled softly behind me, still casting a festive glow. I didn't remove any decorations. I wasn't punishing Christmas. I still cherished it. I simply no longer cherished what it had become. "Hi, sweetie. I'm going to take a short break from family gatherings for a while. I'm fine. Just doing some soul searching. Hope you and Chloe are well." No response. Not that day. Not the next. But I wasn't hurt anymore. I didn't expect anything. I had finally stopped performing for an audience that never looked up from their phones. Days passed quietly. I strolled through the park, cooked only for myself, and began writing in a journal I had neglected for years. I started to reconnect with myself, the woman I had been before I became everyone else's support system. I wasn't angry. That surprised me most. I simply knew I was finished, begging for validation. Some people depart rooms slamming doors. Others, like me, exit so quietly that the silence they leave behind speaks louder than any words could have. I didn't disappear that night. I simply removed myself, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt the faintest flicker of peace return. The week after Christmas was always my favorite time of year, usually filled with leisurely enjoyment of leftovers, captivating books, and peaceful, slumberous mornings. But this year, the silence felt heavier than usual, dense, unforgiving. For the first time in decades, no one visited. No one called. The front door remained closed. The guest slippers in the entryway remained untouched. Even the snow outside seemed cruel. Not magical. Not gentle. Just cold. It was the silence that broke me. Not the tranquil silence of peace, but the oppressive silence that made the walls feel as though they were closing in. One morning, I stood in the doorway of the spare bedroom, the one Chloe used to occupy, and froze. Her favorite quilt still lay folded at the foot of the bed. A small ceramic nightlight shaped like a bunny still sat on the nightstand. I had kept everything, all these years. I walked over, sat on the edge of the mattress, and gazed at the framed photograph on the dresser. Chloe, 8 years old, beaming with 2 missing front teeth, clutching a spelling bee trophy. I had printed that photograph myself, paying extra for the matte finish to prevent fading. I picked it up and traced my thumb across the glass. I couldn't understand where I had lost her. Was it a gradual process? Was there a pivotal moment I should have recognized? A different decision I should have made? Or perhaps I was never truly seen to begin with? That thought crushed me. It wasn't about Chloe anymore. It was about me. About all the ways I had allowed myself to be reduced to a mere service provider. I had given so much of myself, time, money, love, without ever requesting anything substantial in return, because I didn't know how. I had based my self-worth on usefulness. I was the woman who always showed up, the woman who brought the extra casserole, who paid the electricity bill when Isabel fell behind, who remembered birthdays, who cleaned up after everyone had left. That was my identity, my role. And once no one needed me anymore, I became disposable. I had no purpose, no audience, no anchor. That night, I retrieved the old photo albums, not the ones I displayed, but the real ones, filled with school pictures, Mother's Day cards, crayon drawings, and receipts from birthday parties I had paid for, but never received thanks for. Page after page, I saw my own hands in every memory, holding Chloe's hand at the pumpkin patch, cutting Isabel's wedding cake, teaching Arthur how to use the new microwave. I was there, everywhere, yet always behind the camera, always behind the casserole dish, always in the background. I closed the album. My eyes burned. I didn't sleep that night. I wandered through the house like a ghost, touching framed memories as if they were tombstones. The house felt too large, too quiet, too saturated with a love no one had the decency to reciprocate. In the morning, I attempted to shake it off. I bundled up and went for a walk in the park. I hoped the fresh air would clear my mind. But everywhere I looked, there were families laughing, couples, holding hands, children, throwing snowballs, and I was a mere shadow. Amidst them, I sat on a frozen bench, beneath a leafless tree, watching the snow accumulate on my gloves. My breath formed little clouds in the frigid air, and for the first time, I felt truly old, not in the jovial way people refer to aching knees, but profoundly old, unseen, unheard, unwanted. Older people shouldn't take up space. And for a moment, a terrible moment, I believed her. I believed I was an obstacle in their lives, that the best course of action was to shrink, to fade, to disappear. I remained on that bench until my fingers grew numb, until the tea in my travel mug had cooled. I stared into the white expanse and wondered if this was it, if this was how life would remain quiet, unwitnessed. I returned home, removed my coat, and stood before the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked small, smaller than I remembered, her wrinkles deeper, her eyes duller, her shoulders curved inward, as if she were afraid to occupy space. That was the moment. Not a scream, not a breakdown, but stillness. I had reached my lowest point. No more pretense, no more giving, no more hoping they would remember who I was. This was grief, not for their loss, but for the loss of myself. I was gone, and no one had even noticed my departure. It happened on New Year's Day. I hadn't planned to do anything. I hadn't even taken down the Christmas tree. It still stood in the corner of the living room, its lights dimmed, its ornaments slightly drooping, as if it too had been forgotten. I was dusting, not because I cared to, but because my hands needed something to do. I moved around the living room slowly, aimlessly. When I reached the old bookshelf near the fireplace, I noticed the top shelf had accumulated a thin layer of dust. I grabbed a step stool and began wiping it down. That's when I noticed it, a small, yellowed envelope wedged between two photo albums. For Nell. When you need to remember. He used to call me that, Nell. He said my voice sounded like a gentle spring rain. I opened it slowly, carefully unfolding the letter inside. It was dated December 26, 1998. Our last Christmas with his mother, the year Chloe was born. His words returned to me like a soft breeze. My Nell, if you're reading this, I imagine you're feeling lost. You always take care of everyone else. The meals, the traditions, the quiet things no one notices until they stop happening. But I want you to remember something. You matter, even when they forget, even when they grow and drift and take you for granted. You matter. You are the roots, and sometimes roots get buried, but without them, nothing stands. You've given so much of your life to this family, and someday you might feel like they've outgrown you, like your stories no longer interest them, like you've become just grandma, or just mom. But you are never just anything. You are the reason our daughter got through her darkest year. You are the reason Chloe will have the kind of life she's destined for. You are the reason this family knows what love even feels like. So if you ever find yourself in a moment when it feels like you've disappeared, come back to yourself. Read this. Remember your worth. Because even if they forget, I never will. And I know one day they'll remember too. Love you forever, Arthur. I didn't cry immediately. I reread it, then again, then once more, until I could hear his voice speaking each line. Then I pressed the letter to my chest and let the tears fall. But these weren't the tears of the frozen park bench, not the aching sobs of loneliness or rejection. These tears were warm, cleansing, because in that moment, something inside me stirred, not hope exactly, but something quieter, older, deeper, a recollection of who I had been before the silence had crept in, before I had allowed myself to become invisible. I was the woman Arthur had written to, the woman who held families together, who soothed babies through storms, who paid bills with grace, who showed up when others didn't. I was more than someone's outdated grandmother. I was a builder, a keeper of stories, a maker of safety, and just because they couldn't see that didn't mean it had ceased to be true. The next morning, I carefully folded the letter and placed it in the top drawer of my bedside table. Then I made tea, the good kind, with fresh lemon and honey, and sat by the window as the sun filtered through the lace curtains. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own home. I felt real again, present. I had been waiting for them to return and notice me, but perhaps the truth was that I needed to return to myself first. That letter wasn't just a reminder. It was a key. A door had been cracked open, not wide, but enough to let light in, enough to allow me to step through. And I knew, deep down, this was only the beginning. The day after I discovered Arthur's letter, I awoke before sunrise, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't check the family group chat or scroll through photographs I wasn't in. I simply opened the curtains, brewed my favorite dark roast coffee, and watched the soft light illuminate the frost-covered lawn. It felt as if something inside me had been awaiting that letter, waiting for permission to stop shrinking. I donned a thick sweater, wrapped my scarf securely, and walked out to the garden. The rose bushes were dry and brittle, their stems bare, nothing but thorns and memories. I stood there with gloved hands in my pockets, recalling the countless summers I had spent pruning those roses, coaxing them to bloom. Chloe used to kneel beside me with her plastic watering can, pretending to help, while mostly just making a mess. She used to call me her flower whisperer. I said it aloud, just to hear the words again. Flower whisperer. The frost on the petals glistened, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't see death. I saw rest, a season awaiting spring. And I realized that's what I had been doing too. I had allowed myself to wilt under the weight of rejection, to believe that if I wasn't needed, I wasn't worthy. But standing there, in that frozen stillness, I began to perceive something new. Perhaps this season of invisibility wasn't the end of my story. Maybe it was the soil. Who am I without them? Not bitterly, not with resentment, but with genuine curiosity. For the next 2 hours, I wrote, I am a mother. I am a teacher. I am a gardener. I am a woman who once drove cross-country in a station wagon with a toddler and a box of library books just to help Isabel start over. I am a woman who stayed up all night sewing Chloe's unicorn costume from scratch. I am a woman who learned how to live alone after 42 years of marriage. I am a woman who once dreamed of writing a memoir and never did. I looked at the list. It wasn't long, but it was authentic. And for the first time in weeks, I felt proud of who I was, independent of what I had given. That night, I cooked dinner for myself, just me, not leftovers, not something from the freezer. I set the table, lit a candle, poured a glass of wine, not because anyone would see, but because I would. It felt like a small act of rebellion, the quiet woman's stories no one asks for. I laughed aloud. I had completely forgotten about it, but the phrase struck me differently now. Stories no one asks for. I had hundreds of them. Perhaps it was time someone heard them, even if that someone was just me. The next morning, I dusted off my laptop, created a document, and began typing. The words weren't elegant at first, but they were mine. Every morning, I added a little more. Some days, it was a story about Arthur. Others were reflections on motherhood. Sometimes I wrote about silence, aging, or grief. But what surprised me most was how alive I felt doing it. Not because I was producing something, but because I was becoming something again. Chloe hadn't called. Isabel hadn't checked in. The silence hadn't changed, but I had. I was no longer seeking their validation. I had spent so long striving to be useful, needed, essential. Now, I was simply me, and it was enough. I didn't need a seat at their table to prove my worth. I had built a new table, quietly, steadily, and this time there was only one chair, mine. The beauty of being underestimated is that no one sees you coming. That thought resided quietly in the back of my mind, in the days following my awakening. I didn't announce any changes. I didn't write any angry letters or post any dramatic messages online. That had never been my style. I didn't want revenge. I wanted resolution, on my terms. And the first step was reclaiming control over what I had once given away so freely. I started with the college fund. A significant amount remained in the account, even after I destroyed that final check on Christmas Eve. I had built that fund slowly over the years. Birthday checks I never cashed, retirement bonuses I never spent, small amounts I had set aside when Chloe was still in diapers. After closing the account, I opened a new one. This time, it wasn't in Chloe's name. This time, the beneficiary was a local community foundation that provided scholarships to first-generation college students, children with dreams and no safety nets. The foundation director had kind eyes and a gentle voice when she asked, "Is there someone you'd like us to honor the fund in memory of?" I smiled and replied, "Yes, my husband Arthur. He always believed education was a seed, not a transaction." I left the office with a handwritten thank you note and a warmth in my chest I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't about spite, it was about reclaiming purpose. Next came the gifts, all those returned Christmas presents. I took the refunded cash and donated it to the local children's library, the one I used to volunteer at before Chloe's tuition needs had diverted my attention elsewhere. When I visited, The children's librarian, Olivia, greeted me like an old friend. "We've missed you," she said. "The children still talk about your pirate hat from story time." She showed me the underfunded reading room, where shelves stood half empty and crayons were worn down to nubs. I made a mental note of everything they needed. Later that week, I made a donation, not extravagant, but sufficient to cover new books, art supplies, and cozy blankets for the reading corner. And I volunteered again, Tuesday afternoons, just like old times. The space welcomed me back, as if I had never left. No one asked what had changed, and I didn't explain, because that was the gift of silence. It gave me the freedom to move without scrutiny, to build something unburdened by anyone's approval. At home I continued writing. The memoir project I had rediscovered, The Quiet Woman, grew by the day. Every page I typed pulled me further from the shadows I had been inhabiting and closer to the woman I remembered being. I wrote about raising Isabel during lean years, about Arthur's slow decline and unwavering grace, about finding strength in solitude, and I wrote about Chloe, not to shame her, but to understand. Her cruelty had hurt, deeply, but when I viewed her through the lens of storytelling, not just pain, I realized something important. Chloe wasn't malicious, she was thoughtless, self-centered, entitled, yes, but also a product of a world that taught her that aging equated to irrelevance, that quiet love held less value than ostentatious affection. While that didn't excuse her actions, it did provide context. Understanding her didn't alter my boundaries, but it freed me from bitterness. I didn't hate her. I simply no longer allowed her to define my self-worth. One afternoon, while organizing old paperwork in the spare bedroom, I came across the deed to my house. My name was clearly printed on that line in bold black ink, mine alone. A wave of pride washed over me. I had built this home, paid it off myself, and hosted decades of love, meals, and memories under this roof. And I realized I didn't have to diminish myself to remain in their lives. I chose who entered this space now, not out of spite, but out of a desire for peace. So I changed the locks, quietly, without fanfare. Not because I feared anyone, but because it was symbolic. A woman who once freely gave away her keys, trusting they would be cherished, now held them with care. This was not a fortress, but a sanctuary, and only those who valued it would be welcomed back in. It didn't happen all at once, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere in my life began to shift, and for once, the weight of responsibility wasn't solely resting on my shoulders. It started with Isabel. She called one Monday afternoon, while I was at the library sorting picture books with Olivia for the weekly story time. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I saw her name flash across the screen. Missed call, no voicemail. I didn't return the call, not out of spite, but clarity. If she needed me urgently, she would try again. If not, I wouldn't chase after crumbs of conversation any longer. She didn't call again for 5 days. When she finally did, it was Sunday morning. I was in the garden, trimming back some of the dead branches from my rose bushes. Winter was gradually releasing its grip, and I could already see tiny green buds peeking through the brown stems. Life returning, inch by inch. I answered, wiping my gloves on my sweater. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "You've been hard to reach." "I've been busy," I replied simply. She paused. "I wanted to check on you. We missed you at New Year's brunch." I wasn't aware I had been invited. That silenced her for a moment. "Well," she said, "Chloe mentioned you've been distant lately. She's confused." I almost laughed. "Confused? I'm sure she is," I said gently. "But I imagine it's the first time she's had to wonder what I'm thinking." The conversation fizzled after that. No confrontation, just subtle discomfort on her end, and calm boundaries on mine. But something had shifted. For years I had rushed to make things easier, smoothed every wrinkle, eased every tension. Now, I let the awkwardness linger. I didn't fill the silence. I didn't rescue her from the discomfort of having to examine her own behavior. And that silence, it spoke louder than any speech I could have made. A week later, Isabel appeared at my door unannounced. I was baking lemon bars to take to the library for Volunteer Appreciation Day. She stood on the porch with a tight smile and a bag of groceries in her hands. "I thought I'd make us lunch," she offered. I didn't move from the doorway. "Why now?" I asked. She faltered. "I guess I realized you haven't been around. It didn't feel right." I nodded, but said nothing. She stepped inside. The house looked the same, but I could see it in her face. It felt different. There was something about the air, The quiet order, the absence of apology that made her pause. We sat in the kitchen while the lemon bars cooled. She tried to make small talk, asking about the library, the garden, my writing. I answered politely, but briefly. I didn't offer my usual warmth. I wasn't cruel, just balanced. Eventually, she got to it. I think Chloe is struggling more than she lets on. She said, college is intense. She's feeling a lot of pressure. I stirred my tea and waited. She said she feels like you've cut her off, that she doesn't understand what she did wrong. I tilted my head. She called me retro, said old people shouldn't take up space. She was joking, Isabel said quickly. Too quickly. She was careless, I corrected. There's a difference. Isabel looked down at her hands. She needs you, she murmured. I took a breath. She needed me when I was holding up her whole future, when I was quietly paying for everything, encouraging her, loving her, without being asked. But when I stopped being useful, I stopped being visible. I leaned forward, my voice calm. I'm not angry, but I won't be invisible anymore. Isabel didn't argue. That was the moment I realized it. The power had shifted, not because I demanded it, but because I had stopped giving mine away. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to make her comfortable. I wasn't softening my truth to preserve her feelings, and she felt it. That afternoon, she left with a plate of lemon bars and a quiet hug. Not an apology, not yet, but the beginning of one. Later that night, I received an email from the Community Scholarship Foundation. They had already awarded the first grant under Arthur's name. A young woman named Anya, the daughter of a mechanic and a waitress, would be the first recipient. She wrote, "Thank you for seeing potential in someone no one else saw." I cried, not from sadness, but from a sense of fullness, because finally, I was giving to people who saw me back, and I wasn't begging for a seat at the table anymore. I was building something stronger, something rooted in choice, not obligation, and that was power. Even if they forget, you must remember who you are. I remembered, but perhaps, just perhaps, part of remembering was being willing to hear the other side, not to reopen old wounds, but to acknowledge that healing could exist without needing to return to what was. I texted back, "Tell her I'll meet her at the garden. Thursday noon." I chose the garden for a reason. It was neutral, open, alive, a place of growth. Thursday arrived. The sky was clear. The roses, once brittle and dry, had begun to bloom. Pink and red heads bowed gently in the breeze. Proof that seasons do change, even after the harshest winters. Chloe arrived on time. She looked smaller somehow, not physically, but quieter, humbled. Her eyes didn't hold their usual sheen of pride or distraction. She sat on the bench beside me, folding her hands in her lap like a child, bracing for discipline. "Hi, Grandma," she said softly. I nodded. "Hi, Chloe." A pause stretched between us. Not awkward, just full. "I read your article," she said, twice. It made me cry. I didn't respond. I let her continue. "I didn't realize how much I took for granted. You gave so much, and I treated it like background noise." She looked down. "I've had time to think. Losing the tuition money, it shook me. But what hurt more was realizing I lost you. That made me inhale sharply, not because it was manipulative, but because it was honest. I'm not asking for anything," she added quickly. "I just want to say, I'm sorry." I watched her. No tears, no drama, just truth that mattered. "I appreciate that," I said quietly. "Truly." She looked hopeful, almost leaning in, but I stopped her there. "But I need you to understand something, Chloe. I've changed, not out of spite, out of necessity." She nodded slowly. "I get that. I can love you," I said, "and still have boundaries. I can forgive you, and still choose not to fund your future. Love doesn't always mean rescue." Tears welled in her eyes. She didn't wipe them. "I understand," she whispered. "I really do." We sat together for a while longer. I told her about the scholarship fund in Arthur's name, about Anya, about how proud he would have been. And when we stood to leave, Chloe hugged me, not like she used to, not out of routine, but with care. It was enough. Later that evening, I sat alone on my porch, wrapped in a soft shawl, as the sky turned lavender. A cup of tea steamed gently in my hand. The garden stretched before me, alive, bright, forgiving. It had weathered winter, had gone still, seemed dead, and then bloomed again. Not the same as before, but full. So was I. I wasn't the woman who once scrambled to be needed, to feel visible, through service. I was simply Eleanor, a mother, a grandmother, a widow, a woman with quiet strength, and a voice that had finally learned to speak without raising its volume. In the silence, I didn't feel small. I felt whole. I thought of all the women like me, overlooked, underestimated, passed over for being too soft, too quiet, too giving, and I wished they could feel what I felt now. Peace, ownership, light. Somewhere out there, Anya was preparing for her first day of college, unaware that an old woman's dignity was interwoven into her future. And Chloe, maybe she would become a woman who gave to others without forgetting herself. Maybe not. But that wasn't mine to fix anymore. I looked out at the blooming roses and smiled, because the thing about roots is, they go deep, even when no one sees them, even when no one says, thank you. They hold everything up. And now, I was holding myself, finally.